Quote, I am utterly amazed, utterly enchanted. I have a precursor, and what a precursor! I hardly knew Spinoza. That I should have turned to him just now was inspired by instinct. Not only is his over-tendency like mine, namely, to make all knowledge the most powerful affect, but in 5 main points of his doctrine I recognize myself. This most unusual and loneliest thinker is closest to me precisely in these matters. He denies the freedom of the will, teleology, the moral world order, the unegoistic, and evil. Even though the divergences are admittedly tremendous, they are due more to the difference in time, culture, and science. In summa, my lonesomeness, which, as on very high mountains, often made it hard for me to breathe and made my blood rush out, is now at least a twosomeness. End quote. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that letter to Franz Overbeck from Sils Maria on July 30th, 1881. And what immediately follows in that letter is Nietzsche's complaint of his recent ill health. He ends the letter as follows, quote, I am not at all as well as I had hoped. Exceptional weather here too. Eternal change of atmospheric conditions, that will yet drive me out of Europe. I must have clear skies for months, else I get nowhere. Already 6 severe attacks of 2 or 3 days each. With affectionate love, your friend. End quote. I wanted to quote the end of that letter because it's rarely quoted when bringing up the connection between Nietzsche and Spinoza. Usually people leave that last part out. But I think it helps to situate Nietzsche's sense of kinship with Spinoza in the context of the time in his life when he first encounters Spinoza's thought here in 1881. Nietzsche had stopped teaching at the university in 1878. His health had gotten so bad that reading and writing had become a real difficulty for him, and his migraines and stomach pains had only gotten worse. Nietzsche writes of this period in Ecce Homo as a time of experimentation, looking for some combination of altitude, air pressure, humidity, and so on that would be best suited to his condition. This is the time where he becomes a solitary wanderer, summering in the Swiss Alps, spending his winters in northern Italy. Nietzsche had been in a constant process of departure from the beliefs and thoughts and values of those around him ever since he was a young man, when he had left the religion of his Lutheran pastor father and horrified his mother and sister by refusing to take communion. That was years behind him by the time of the 1880s. Nietzsche had studied and taught the classics of Greek and Latin antiquity rather than the Bible or Christian theology as his family had initially expected him to do. But Nietzsche had increasingly grown to see himself as standing apart from his peers in academia as well. While it was his illness that had forced him into early retirement, in the years after his tenure at Basel, he wrote scathingly of scholars. This period in his life was also after his break with Richard Wagner. His relationship with the Wagners had soured, and he'd repudiated the Wagnerians with whom he'd once tried to feel a sense of community. Nietzsche's philosophical project during this time was deeply influenced by the French philosophers such as La Rochefoucauld, Montaigne, and Voltaire, and his first purely philosophical work, Human All Too Human, attempted a naturalistic approach to metaphysics, to ethics, and to human life, much in that same tradition. But in the early 1880s, Nietzsche found himself on the cusp of a new approach to philosophy, in which he would depart from the skepticist, rationalist project of his middle period, and set out to create most of the major concepts in his philosophy for which he is remembered. Nietzsche, as he says himself in the letter we just read, is a lonely man at this time. In his works, he creates this character called the Wanderer, the one who has strayed so far from the deeply held truths of the collective that he finds himself permanently alienated from the collective. Nietzsche felt himself doomed to become a sort of philosophical vagabond, and he warned free spirits of the coming age that the most immoral thing possible is always to follow the will to truth. Pursuing truth is always called immoral because it involves examining or vivisecting the contemporary morality. To truly inquire, one must think extra-morally. They must think about the origins and the value of one's own morality. This way of thinking is by definition immoral. Baruch Spinoza is a kindred figure that Nietzsche finds during this period, and he goes so far as to call him a precursor. This is not the kind of thing Nietzsche normally acknowledges for other thinkers, especially when the thinker in question is not a pre-Socratic Greek or perhaps an obscure scientific mind like Boscovich. Nietzsche tends to hold a pretty negative view of most past philosophers of the Enlightenment, generally seeing in them a kind of psychological error as the driver of their thought. But in this letter, he lists 5 points of similarity, which we'll consider in this episode today. All 5 concern the philosophical postulates of these two men, rather than anything about their lives or character. Nietzsche's not looking for a sort of similarity of spirit. He's saying we actually have a similarity of thought. But it may be helpful to consider Spinoza's life as the background of Spinoza's thought. In fact, his life also bears so many important similarities with Nietzsche that his biography may have also factored into Nietzsche's understanding of Spinoza as a brother soul in the long history of philosophical discourse, but that's more of my own intuition speaking here. Spinoza lived from 1632 to 1677. He was a Sephardic Jew. His family came from Portugal, but relocated to the Netherlands before Spinoza was born. There, Spinoza and his family lived among the community of Jewish expats that the Dutch treated with far more toleration than the Jews had experienced in the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish Inquisition, quite famous to us now, thanks to Monty Python among other sources, is often portrayed in popular media as a hunt for witches or for heretics. And that was certainly involved, but the original focus of the Spanish Inquisition was to enforce Catholicism against the Muslim and Jewish populations that existed in Iberia following the Reconquista. By the 15th century, the Catholics had full control of Spain and Portugal, and the Pope gave the monarchs of these countries permission to create inquisitors who would inquire into the sincerity of those who held the Christian faith, particularly the conversos. These were Iberian Jews who had converted to Christianity but were still treated with suspicion by the population at large. They also focused their attention on the Moors who had chosen to remain in Spain after the Reconquista and had also converted to Christianity. And in spite of this conversion, they were eventually expelled anyway, and those who refused to go were executed. The Inquisition was therefore tasked with rooting out insincere Christians, but their focus was on such groups as the Jews who had been forced to convert, under the suspicion that it was a false conversion, and that they were still secretly practicing their religion. And over hundreds of years, the Inquisition operated this way in Spain in the attempt to reshape a multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multicultural society into a homogeneous society. And they largely succeeded. As a result of this hostile environment towards any non-Catholics in Spain, and even towards formerly non-Catholics, there was a dispersion of Jews into other places in Europe, and Spinoza's family ended up in the Netherlands. And there they lived as part of an enclave within Dutch society, where they were guaranteed religious freedom, but were still regarded as apart from Christian society in many respects. This background will help us make sense of why the backlash against Spinoza and his perceived irreligiosity was so severe. Spinoza was a gifted and kind young man, a gentle soul according to all who knew him. He is sometimes referred to as Baruch, his Hebrew name, but he was named Benedict in Latin documents, since Baruch meant blessed, so it's a translation. His mother died when he was 6 years old, and he was raised by his father and his father's third wife. He was brought up in an education in the Torah and the Talmud, and had the benefit of learning from teachers of great prominence within the community. He studied previous Jewish philosophers such as Abraham ibn Ezra and Moses Maimonides, influences which may have already laid the groundwork for the heresy that Spinoza would later be accused of committing. These previous thinkers had applied historical critique to the Old Testament of the Bible. They had suggested allegorical interpretations of some passages. Spinoza was a prodigy in mathematics and geometry. He was also a polyglot. He became fluent in his native Hebrew and Spanish, as well as Portuguese, Dutch, and Latin. And later, I believe he learned Italian and French as well, so a man who spoke close to 7 languages with various degrees of fluency. Spinoza's father died in 1654 and left a considerable inheritance, but Spinoza's half-sister from a previous marriage challenged him for that inheritance. Spinoza won the case, and then he promptly gave her the inheritance anyway, except for a single item, a bed. With this small piece of property to his name, Baruch Spinoza now lived on his own. He became a lens grinder by trade. Like Pascal and like Nietzsche, Spinoza was often in ill health, and it has also been suggested that he inherited a consumptive tendency from his mother. Spinoza's philosophical and theological inquiries continued after his education. He began to doubt the doctrine of personal immortality, which admittedly is not quite of central importance to the Jewish faith, certainly not as important to the Jewish faith as to the Christian. But beyond this, Spinoza began to wonder if God himself might possess a body made of matter, or whether the freedom of the will was a coherent concept, or whether the stories of miracles might be explicable by natural means. Eventually, he began to lose his faith, and he confided these doubts to some of his closest friends, who immediately went and told the rabbis at the synagogue. While we might certainly impugn these friends for betraying Spinoza's trust, the reaction of the synagogue might be a bit more understandable to us, given that they had to maintain the good graces of the Dutch people, because they knew it was solely by those good graces that they lived in relative peace and security in the Netherlands. Europe was not a friendly place to the Jews in those times, and while it was one thing if you were simply practicing the religion of the Old Covenant, it's quite another if there were heretics saying blasphemous things within your ranks. And the synagogue knew that if they didn't manage their own affairs, it might provoke the Dutch to do it for them. Spinoza was summoned to the synagogue, and there one of his former teachers begged him to recant. The rabbis offered Spinoza a stipend if he would at least occasionally attend the services in the synagogue, and if he would make no more public criticisms of the Torah. But Spinoza refused. They first gave him a temporary excommunication and forbade him from interacting with anyone in the Jewish community for 30 days. Spinoza had already moved out of the Jewish quarter, and he remarked that they were punishing him with something that he would have done anyway. So he was not dissuaded at all, and the controversy became even more intense. Finally, on the 27th of July, 1656, the rabbis decreed that Spinoza was to be excommunicated permanently and cast out from the Jewish community. He was no longer to be one of them. Spinoza was summoned to the Portuguese synagogue to have the curses read out against him and hear the prohibitions against having any interaction with him. We have the text of that excommunication, which I'll now read. Quote, "The lords of the Mahmad, the governing body of 6 Parnasim, and the Gabai, announce that, having long known of the evil opinions and acts of Baruch Spinoza, they have endeavored by various means and promises to turn him from his evil ways. But having failed to make him mend his wicked ways, and on the contrary, daily receiving more and more serious information about the abominable heresies which he practiced and taught, and about his monstrous deeds, and having for this numerous trustworthy witnesses who have deposed and borne witness to this effect in the presence of said Spinoza, they have become convinced of the truth of this matter. And after all of this has been investigated in the presence of the honorable rabbis, they have decided, with their consent, that the said Spinoza should be excommunicated and expelled from the people of Israel. By decree of the angels, and by the command of the holy men, we excommunicate, expel, curse, and damn Baruch Spinoza, with the consent of God, blessed be he, and with the consent of the entire holy congregation, and in front of these holy scrolls with the 613 precepts which are written therein, cursing him with the excommunication with which Joshua banned Jericho, and with the curse which Elisha cursed the boys, and with all the castigations which are written in the book of the law. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. Cursed be he when he goes out, and cursed be he when he comes in. The Lord will not spare him. But then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy shall smoke against this man, and all the curses that are written in this book shall lie upon him, and the Lord shall blot out his name from under heaven, and the Lord shall separate him unto evil out of all the tribes of Israel, according to all the curses of the covenant that are written in this book of the law. But you that cleave unto your Lord your God are alive, every one of you, this day. No one should communicate with him, neither in writing, nor accord him any favor, nor stay with him under the same roof, nor within 4 cubits of his vicinity, nor shall he read any treatise composed or written by him." End quote. Baruch Spinoza would thereafter spend the rest of his life as a man without a people, without an ethnicity, without a religion. While some leading minds among various Christian sects tried to claim Spinoza, he resisted any such ties that bind. He remained outside of any kind of spiritual community for the rest of his life. He accepted his excommunication in a manner that can only be called serene. He accepted it with equanimity. Nonetheless, it was a hard life. He no longer had any support structure, and one night a religious zealot tried to stab Spinoza on the street. He got away with a torn jacket and a cut on his neck, but without losing life or limb. He then spent a few months in a nearby village, although he eventually returned to Amsterdam. He's often portrayed as a solitary figure, which he was in many respects, but as with Nietzsche, those characterizations have often been exaggerated. In fact, Spinoza had many correspondents and admirers, all of them Gentiles. He exchanged letters and made friends among the intelligentsia of Amsterdam. But like with Nietzsche, Spinoza felt that he needed solitude in order to develop his thoughts and speculations. He needed to be away from the hustle and bustle of society. Because he felt that his visiting with friends was taking too much time away from his philosophical work, Spinoza left Amsterdam in 1660 and moved to the village of Rijnsburg, where he lived with a Mennonite family for the next 3 years of his life. It was during this period, in this quiet settlement near the River Rhine, that his philosophical work began in earnest. As always, the locals were charmed with Spinoza, by the way. Eventually, he moved to the town of Voorburg, near The Hague. He lived there for 6 years, where he continued to earn a living polishing and grinding lenses, and he wrote one of his major works, a treatise on theology and politics, or Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. This work is a great example of a tract that might have been massively controversial during its time, but whose precepts are almost so widely accepted now that it hardly bears arguing for them. Spinoza said of this work, quote, "As I marked the fierce controversies of philosophers raging in church and state, the source of bitter hatred and dissension, I determined to examine the Bible afresh in a careful, impartial, and unfettered spirit, making no assumptions concerning it, and attributing to it no doctrines which I do not find clearly therein set down. With these precautions, I constructed a method of scriptural interpretation." End quote. Spinoza's reason for writing this treatise, as he suggests here, has a great deal to do with the current events going on at that time. The War of the United Provinces against Louis XIV had prompted the Dutch government to pass tighter restrictions on speech. The Dutch Calvinists used the scriptures as a justification for opposing the more liberal parties within society, who were fighting for freedom of expression. Spinoza's endeavor was to show that the scriptures are human in origin, and thus fallible. Many of the liberal voices in Dutch society were Spinoza's friends, and he saw the Calvinists as yet another dogmatic movement whose thought was circumscribed by fear. Still, Spinoza's treatise rejected atheism, and as we get into Spinoza's philosophy, we'll see that he still very much feels a sense of wonderment and even worship for the divine. He sees divinity in nature, and this is not cheap talk for Spinoza, the way it might be for some people. At least that's the sense that I get. Spinoza really feels a kind of worshipfulness towards the majesty of the cosmos, which he believes is divine. But he could not affix his name to this treatise during this time, which questioned the infallibility of Jewish and Christian scripture, without taking on a massive risk to his own safety, so he published it anonymously. In response, church councils at Amsterdam, at The Hague, and elsewhere attacked the book and petitioned for its ban and confiscation. Its author was called Satan Incarnate. Spinoza eventually moved to The Hague, where he spent the remaining years of his life. He continued writing his magnum opus, The Ethics. He'd begun the Ethics in 1662 and had worked on it on and off for basically his entire life up to that point. During this time, he met the German philosopher Leibniz, who is often also classed among the rationalists with Spinoza. And at one time, there's even a story, because Spinoza was known to be this sort of heretical figure, that Leibniz warned Spinoza that his life was in danger. But what ended up taking out Spinoza was his own health, which began to decline in late 1676. And it's been suggested that breathing in the microshards of glass particles while grinding lenses over a long career of doing so may have been responsible for Spinoza's early death. But it must be said, he was always of a consumptive and sickly nature. By February of 1677, he fell ill for several weeks and did not recover. He died without receiving any religious rites, and he was buried without any religious ceremony in the cemetery of the New Church of The Hague. His manuscripts were taken into the care of his friends, who had them printed later that year. The Ethics is Spinoza's most famous work, and it takes the form of a geometrical proof. Indeed, Spinoza thought that the only serious philosophy was a mathematized philosophy. His writing style is about as far from the meandering essays of Montaigne as it is from the short, sharp, aphoristic ruminations of a Pascal. Rather, if you've not read Spinoza but have read Wittgenstein, I think you'll find a familiarity with the way that Spinoza writes. I think the influence on Wittgenstein is rather clear. It should be said, also, the scholastic tradition of the Middle Ages may have impacted Spinoza's writing style. He begins from a set of clear definitions, lays out his axioms, argues with a rigorous logic. Spinoza's Ethics takes as its task not merely to produce an ethical philosophy, as the name suggests, That's sort of the crowning achievement of the work, or the fruit of the work that comes in the later chapters. But Spinoza begins by attempting to produce a complete picture of the world. Spinoza philosophizes in the style of the pre-Socratics in that way, and that he aims to capture universal existence in the form of concepts. But the variation here is that he does this with the mathematical precision that could only have come about following the scientific revolutions of the Enlightenment. The long-term effect of Spinoza's philosophical contributions have often been understated, in my opinion, at least relative to the amount of attention that he gets compared to other popular philosophers. Spinoza's work did not represent a sudden revolution in philosophical thought, demarcating off this clear epoch before and after him in the way that, say, Descartes or Immanuel Kant did. What we see instead is that in the centuries that followed, the afterglow of Spinoza's vision of the world appears on the words of so many different thinkers. And this isn't limited to philosophy. I mean, certainly Hegel says that to be a philosopher is to be a Spinozist, which attests to the influence of Spinoza in the German Academy at that time, which was considerable. But Spinoza's effect is also strangely resonant outside of philosophical circles. Goethe is one famous example of an artist who was influenced by Spinoza, enamored with Spinoza even. The Shelleys, Lord Byron, Matthew Arnold, and the other English romantic neo-pagans, these great authors and poets of that stripe, could also be included here. It's a funny thing because even though Spinoza is at least as difficult as Kant, in some ways more difficult than Kant to read, but in the wake of Kant, pretty much the only people who are engaging with Kantianism are philosophers, and they're doing so at the level of logical argumentation, philosophical discourse. With Spinoza's influence, we find that it is also authors and playwrights. And meanwhile, it's difficult to find a philosopher who made it their main project to attack or refute Spinoza, nor do we find that many who hold him up as their supreme influence. It seems that Spinozism is simply in the oxygen of philosophy, in the oxygen of art and science in the centuries after his death. Many borrow from him in part, or take issue with some individual stance that the man took, but his work is so rarely approached or critiqued in its totality, probably because doing so is so difficult and time-consuming. And so, to use the language of Robert Pirsig, Spinoza is a classical-style philosopher. His work is concerned with underlying form, with structure, both in its style and in its substance, and that Spinoza's work is rigorously structured, and it's concerned with ascertaining the structure of the world around us. But the Spinozism that sends its waves through the zeitgeist is almost always a romantic view of what Spinoza represents. Romantic here meaning the outward appearance, the feeling that one gets from Spinoza, the vibe, we might say. And it's along those lines that we see the influence of Spinoza on the Romantics of the 19th century, insofar as one of the main aspects of Spinoza, which we will now examine, is that God is nature. Nature is God. Spinoza writes in the Ethics, quote, "Whatsoever is in God, and without God nothing can be or be conceived." End quote. And so the terms God and nature are interchangeable. A third term is substance. God, nature, and substance. And to get at what Spinoza's meaning is here, it would be helpful to consider the etymology of that term, substance. We think of substance in English as stuff. If you use substance as a noun, it usually refers to a chemical, a liquid, or a drug, right? But the meaning is sub, under, beneath, or up to, and stance, to stand, set down, make, or be firm. So substance is that which stands beneath matter, that which makes it what it is. The meaning of the Latin substantia is being, essence, material. We might recall Spinoza's notion of his younger years that I mentioned in passing, that God might have a body that is material. One could argue that in the Ethics, the idea that Spinoza puts forward when he calls God substance is that same idea, but the body that God has is the entire material world. This is a view that is usually classified as pantheism, that God is everywhere in nature. God is immanent. God is here, now, at every moment, in everything. All nature is God, and even though there are apparent differences between things, we see all these different objects and forces and beings, that is God as God exists in different attributes and different modes. God, as an infinite being, in fact, must possess infinite attributes, according to Spinoza, but as beings in the world of nature, we know two of them, which are intellect and extension. And if the terms intellect and extension are not immediately clear, we could rename those attributes mind and body. And before we continue further with Spinoza, it's worth saying a word or two about Descartes' view of mind and body, since that's central to Descartes' meditations, and one of Spinoza's main influences is Descartes. In fact, Spinoza is considered a continuation of the rationalist school of epistemology that Descartes launched, even though in many ways his work is a critique of Descartes. For Descartes, mind and body are distinct. They are two different substances. Descartes says in the sixth of his meditations, quote, "On the one hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself, insofar as I am a thinking, non-extended thing. And on the other hand, I have a distinct idea of body, insofar as this is simply an extended, non-thinking thing. And accordingly, it is certain that I am really distinct from my body and exist without it." End quote. And in so many words, that's the starting point of Cartesian dualism, that notion, based on Descartes' certainty that what he truly is mind, and that his mind is distinct from his body. Descartes establishes his philosophy based on his methodology of doubt. He begins, like Montaigne the skeptic, but unlike Montaigne, he resolves to come to some kind of certainty, to find the bedrock truths which he can know as a starting axiom. The starting axiom for Descartes is, I think, therefore I am. One cannot doubt the mind, because to think a doubting thought about the mind means to presuppose a mind that thinks the doubting thought. And so even in one's doubts, one can be certain of their own mind. But we must remember that Descartes doubts the entire physical world, the entirety of his sense experience. This happens more or less over the course of the first two meditations. And he cannot find certainty in the body by the same route that he uses to establish certainty in the mind. So it's right from the start of his project that mind and body are presumed to be separable, because through pure rationality, he can establish certainty in the mind, but he can't use that same route to establish certainty in the body. And they're regarded as fundamentally different types of phenomena, that of the body and that of the mind. The proof of one is not the proof of the other. And the distinction Descartes makes is extension. Bodies exist in space. They have some form which is extended and non-interpenetrable, whereas mind has no such localized spatial existence. It's not extended. It takes up no space. And so matter appears to be unthinking, whereas thinking appears to be immaterial. And so the key point is that Descartes then argues that these constitute two different substances, that mind is of a different nature or essence than material being. Some have noted that perhaps Giordano Bruno's work had an effect on Spinoza and how he responds to Descartes. Bruno, this scientific mind and philosopher who was burned at the stake by the Catholic Church, had taken the Aristotelian notion of the incorporeal soul within man as the animating principle or the divine spark that creates movement in living beings, and he had applied that idea to the entire universe. Bruno claimed that the world has a world soul, the soul of God, which animated the movements of the planets and other heavenly bodies. So just as, the reason why you as a living being, unlike an inanimate rock, right, is able to move around and do things and think things, it's because you have an animating spirit, a soul, a spark within you. Well, how is it that the heavens and the stars and the planets can revolve and move? There must be some sort of animating spirit or soul within all of the world. And furthermore, Bruno rejected the Aristotelian view that the universe was finite in terms of its extension, that it was a definite, limited body. Bruno believed in a cosmos that was infinite, as the cosmos itself was coterminous with the person of God. He accordingly took mind and matter to be one substance, and he argued that every part of the physical world has a mental aspect, and every mental aspect was also physical. So there's a very clear line of influence to what Spinoza will eventually argue. Spinoza's view of mind and extension is an attempt at resolving the Cartesian dualism, and it comes with this influence from Bruno. Mind and extension are, for Spinoza, not different substances, but attributes of the same substance, which is nature, or God. This is a monism. The same thing, quote unquote, is incarnated into living beings, that is also incarnated into rocks and trees and planets, as well as mind, and thoughts and doubts and all of these things. For Spinoza, the key point is that the substance, the thing that stands beneath both mind and extension, in all its forms, is the same. Spinoza argues, quote, "It is thus evident that, though two attributes are, in fact, conceived as distinct, that is, one without the help of the other, yet we cannot therefore conclude that they constitute two entities, or two different substances." End quote. And he insists, throughout the Ethics, that there is only one substance. One of the ways that he arrives at this conclusion is via the observation of the interdependence of all beings. All phenomena seem to arise as the result of previously existing causes and conditions. We don't witness ex nihilo creation events, nor do we witness events happening with no prior cause that's set it into motion. Such that if we were to ask, what is the cause of you might first say, well, it's my parents. And then if you were pressed further, you would say, well, it's their parents and their parents' parents. And you'd have to go all the way back to the first human beings and then the first organisms that coalesced in the Earth's surface. And you could go all the way back to the Big Bang before you got to a first cause. And even that's, I guess, debatable. But I don't want to construe this as an argument springing purely from a temporal first cause argument, because what Spinoza is really looking for is some unit of being that exists independently of its other modes, or that is to say, the other embodiments of being. So one could say you exist, and you are separate from the soil beneath your feet, but you're not separable from it. You cannot exist without the crops that are grown in the soil, because then you would starve. Meaning that regardless of what caused you, you're dependent on the soil for your continued existence, to continue to persevere in the form in which you exist. You're separate from the atmosphere, and yet there are no humans in existence if that atmosphere doesn't exist for them to breathe, such that humanity's existence is dependent also on the existence of an oxygen atmosphere. And there are some who have drawn comparisons in this respect to Buddhism and the Buddhist idea of the dependent origination of phenomena. The fact that we do not find a singular essence or being within individual phenomena, but rather that events and objects that we experience as independent things are in fact, we experience them that way because we arbitrarily aggregate other smaller constituent parts which are not themselves identical with one another, all of which are dependent on other phenomena for their very existence. The Spinozan claim is that the substance of reality is that which is itself dependent on nothing, but upon which everything depends. No individual embodiment of that substance within nature can be said to be truly independent. The only thing which is not dependent on some other thing is the totality. That is to say, all of nature, and this totality is so vast and ineffable and mysterious, and the cause of all being. And so it is the only word that we can really apply to it within our theological language would be God. This totality includes within it the world of the intellect and the world of matter, and therefore a given event might be perceived as a physical event or as a mental event. But in truth, the substance is prior to both and the cause of both. And therefore every event has both of those aspects, or it could be viewed from either attribute, depending on what one's perspective is. Spinoza explains this in one of his notes on Proposition 7, where he writes, quote, "Whatsoever can be perceived by the infinite intellect as constituting the essence of substance belongs altogether only to one substance. Consequently, substance thinking and substance extended are one and the same substance, comprehended now through one attribute, now through the other. So also, a mode of extension and the idea of that mode are one and the same thing, though expressed in two ways. This truth seems to have been dimly recognized by those Jews who maintained that God, God's intellect, and the things understood by God are identical. For instance, a circle existing in nature, and the idea of a circle existing, which is also in God, are one and the same thing displayed through different attributes. Thus, whether we conceive nature under the attribute of extension, or under the attribute of thought, or under any other attribute, we shall find the same order, or one and the same chain of causes. That is, the same things following in either case." End quote. Spinoza's pantheism therefore suggests a world in which all that which is material is suffused with mind. The sense impression of the material world, the experience of the physical, is the same thing as the idea of the physical, or rather its representation, to use German idealistic language here. There's no material world outside of the mind, and there's no mind conceivable outside of the physical world. Solution: mind and matter are the same substance, regarded from the standpoint of different attributes. All exists within that same substance, which is nature or God, and there's nothing conceivable outside of it. So we are nature, we are God, and not in a megalomaniacal sense, but in the sense of being an inextricable part of the totality, which is itself beyond all comprehension. And so the river, the stone, the mountains, the forests, human beings, these are all modi, or modes, the merely temporary modifications of substance. Every individual thing is an embodiment of the divine, but from our perception they are transitory. I do want to stress here that, like Nietzsche, even though Spinoza's model could be classed as a theory based on relationships of forces, Spinoza does not deny that these individual things do exist. Each form, each mode, has its own perfection, Spinoza argues, its own good, we might say. To put it into the language of Nietzsche, every form of life has its own optimal conditions for the expression of its own individual power. The perfection of one mode is not perfection as such, but simply the perfection of that particular way of being, just as Nietzsche also would argue. But Spinoza would perhaps differ from Nietzsche in the important respect that if we look at the totality, we will see that all of the modes are part of a whole which is itself eternal. To be a vulgar scientific materialist for a minute, we might just simply look to the ideas of conservation of mass, conservation of energy. Now imagine that that same mass, that same energy, the totality of it that comprises the whole universe, and the laws that govern that matter and energy, that is God. And unlike Nietzsche, Spinoza still tries to encompass the whole in his work. Whereas in Nietzsche, we really only find that kind of thing in his unpublished notes. And I get the impression that in his more sober moments, he tended to think that that was a mistake. The reason why this Spinozist world was so influential on the Romantics, therefore, is again because of a sort of a poetical transfiguration of Spinoza's geometrical approach to philosophy. The Romantics, especially the Hellenists, like Goethe, were very attracted to the idea of the divine as immanently present in all nature. This kind of world lends itself to the contemplation of mere appearance, but now this can be reimagined as a kind of transcendental exercise. The portrayal of natural scenes, or the Greek myths of wood nymphs and the piping of Pan, the celebration of the human body, the fascination with all of this follows from the introduction of just such a pantheistic outlook, which we can broadly source to Spinoza. If nature is divine, if nature is God, then portraying beauty in scenes of nature can be worshipful rather than mere entertainment. And furthermore, this gives us a focus of worship which does not include scenes of the otherworldly, scenes from the Bible, scenes of the Day of Judgment, and so on. Spinoza provides that mental framework, geometrically argued though it is, that paradoxically forms the basis of so much 18th and 19th century Romantic art and literature. And relevant to this podcast, historians have seen this tendency not just in Goethe, but also in Wagner and even in Nietzsche. Now, of course, this view of God is definitely heretical from the point of view of any Catholic or Calvinist, since the necessary consequence of Spinoza's ideas is to make God impersonal. This is because, as Spinoza argues repeatedly, God is not susceptible to the same passions that we are. He writes in one of his notes, quote, "Those who confuse the two natures, divine and human, readily attribute human passions to the deity, especially so long as they do not know how passions originate in the mind." End quote. And what he indicates here when he says that passions originate in the mind is that passions, quote, "along with will, desire, love, etc., must be referred to the natura naturata, not to the natura naturans. That is, individual minds with their desires, emotions, and volitions are modes and modifications contained in God as the totality of things, but not pertaining to him as the law and life of the world." End quote. Again, to explain some terms here, the natura naturata is generated or created nature. That is to say, the many different modes of being that exist in the form of the various embodied phenomena. So, people, trees, rocks, quasars, etc. The natura naturans is the creative aspect of nature, the activity of nature itself, we might say. The aspect of nature that gives birth, that generates new beings, that is moving and vital and so on, rather than what is birthed, the beings themselves that are generated. So we might say that we still retain these two senses of the word nature to this very day, insofar as people will say, "I'm going to spend the day in nature," which means spending the day among the created forms of nature, the trees and the rocks and so on, what Spinoza called the modes, versus when we say this is a law of nature, which means a description of how life, how everything in the cosmos behaves. And so passions, will, intellect, desire, love, these exist within the individual modes, but they do not belong to the natura naturans, which is like the élan vital, the power of motion within spatial bodies, the power to procreate, the generating force of nature rather than what is generated. Similarly, God in his totality is not afflicted by passions, as Spinoza reiterates in his note to Proposition 15, quote, "Some assert that God, like a man, consists of body and mind, and is susceptible of passions. How far such persons have strayed from the truth is sufficiently evident from what has been said." End quote. But that means, if we take that seriously, that God has no emotions, no feelings, no desires, meaning God feels nothing and wants nothing. This is a very different view of God from the God described by the Bible, who will say that he loves certain things, that he hates certain things, that he wants certain things. To the extent that God has intellect at all, Spinoza would say that intellect exists within the individual minds of generated things that have intellect. And so Spinoza writes, quote, "The human mind is part of a certain infinite intellect," end quote. But God himself, he's not a self-reflected, desiring personal being. Spinoza argues, quote, "There is will in God, but only in the sense of the laws operating everywhere. His will is law," end quote. He says elsewhere that God is, quote, "the indwelling, not the transient, cause of all things," end quote. And, quote, "God is not in any one place, but is everywhere according to his essence," end quote. Perhaps most importantly, God does not require a self-reflective ego consciousness in order to act in the world, because God, quote, "does not act from freedom of will," end quote. It's widely known about Spinoza's philosophy that it is deterministic. As Nietzsche says in that letter, he denies freedom of the will, just as Nietzsche does. He denies that individual human beings possess freedom of the will. In Spinoza's view, we do not act apart from causes and conditions that produced us and the current circumstances in which we find ourselves. If you trace back the origin of one's actions, you would find that your own actions are just as much in the grip of causality as any heavenly body in orbit. But Spinoza goes even further than this. He denies free will of God also. God's will is not therefore a want or desire on the part of a personal being. The term God's will should be understood as the eternal and unchangeable order of the universe. God contains the totality of all desires or wills as they exist within the embodied physical modes of existence, just as he contains all the intellects within that totality. But God himself is unafflicted by passions. He governs as the immanent realization of an omnipresent and eternal will. That is, the laws of nature. The reason why we have misunderstood this, according to Spinoza, is our human fallibility and ignorance. Spinoza writes, quote, "All such opinions spring from the notion commonly entertained that all things in nature act as men themselves act, namely with an end in view. It is accepted as certain that God himself directs all things to a definite goal. For it is said that God made all things for man, and man that he might worship him. I will therefore consider this opinion. I will point out its falsity. I will show how it has given rise to prejudices about good and bad, right and wrong, praise and blame, order and confusion, beauty and ugliness, and the like." End quote. These prejudices that Spinoza just listed off, about beauty and ugliness, for example, are simply a reflection of our own finite perspective on nature that we then apply as a universal law over nature. But really, it's just our own finite perspective. It's not actually a perspective on the infinite, because that would require ourselves to be infinite. Quote, "Beauty is not so much a quality of the object beheld as an effect in him who beholds it. The most beautiful hand, seen through the microscope, will appear horrible. I do not attribute to nature either beauty or deformity, order or confusion. Only in relation to our imagination can things be called beautiful or ugly." End quote. In modern times, this is a kind of truism. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But this was not such an obvious point in Spinoza's own time, and what he's doing here, fundamentally, is taking value judgments out of the objective world and placing them within the subjective. He's establishing a boundary line between subjectivity and objectivity, which is fairly important considering that he's made all mind and matter the same fundamental substance. And so beauty and ugliness is part of that transitory aspect. The embodied, generated aspect is where we find beauty and ugliness. But nothing is beautiful or ugly in itself from the ultimate perspective, from the point of view of God, we might say. From the viewpoint of the totality of being, nothing is beautiful or ugly. The same is true of morality. Because if the will of God is to be understood as coterminous with the laws of nature, and God is said to have no such personal will or motive, no design for mankind, then there is no morality woven into that will either. There's no way that God wants us to act because God doesn't have wants or desires. We have wants and desires, and thus we have a way that we think that human beings should act. So there is, in other words, no teleology for mankind, no purpose for which we were created. In Spinoza's view, all beings strive for their own perfection. The term perfection can be called synonymous with the good. He writes, quote, "The perfection of things is to be judged by their nature and power alone. Nor are they more or less perfect because they delight or offend the human senses, or because they are benevolent to prejudicial human nature. If anything in nature seems to us ridiculous, absurd, or evil, it is because we know only in part, and are almost entirely ignorant of, the order and interdependence of nature as a whole, and also because we want everything to be arranged according to the dictates of our human reason. In reality, that which reason considers evil is not evil in respect to the order and laws of nature as a whole, but only in respect to the laws of our reason." End quote. So in the 1600s, Spinoza has invented existentialism by making existence prior to any purpose for it. And he's also anticipated the arguments of moral cynics such as Hume and Nietzsche. Importantly here, human reason is made into something small and limited in comparison with the totality of an amoral universe. Our reason is something which does not apprehend nature as a whole, but simply grabs one particular slice of it from our human perspective on nature, the perspective of our mode of being. This is the consequence of Spinoza's impersonal, deterministic view of the divine. We find that we've already stepped beyond good and evil by considering it. And many have debated whether or not Spinoza was an atheist on account of this. Will Durant, in his chapter on Spinoza, in his collection The Story of Civilization, in the section about God, writes about this. He writes, quote, "He conceived God as mind as well as matter, and he did not reduce mind to matter. He acknowledged that mind is the only reality directly known. He felt that his ascription of mind and intelligence to God absolved him from the charge of atheism, and it must be admitted that he spoke repeatedly of his God in terms of religious reverence, often in terms quite consonant with the conception of God in Maimonides or Aquinas. Novalis would call Spinoza the God-intoxicated man. Actually, he was intoxicated with the whole order of nature, which, in its eternal consistency and movement, seemed to him admirable and sublime. And in Book 1 of the Ethics, he wrote both a system of theology and a metaphysics of science. In the world of law, he felt a divine revelation greater than any book, however noble and beautiful. The scientist who studies that law, even in its pettiest and most prosaic detail, is deciphering the revelation. For, quote, "The more we understand individual objects, the more we understand God." This sentence struck Goethe as one of the profoundest in all literature. End quote. Consequently, Spinoza's deterministic world is one in which the arbitrary freedom of the will can be nothing more than a fiction. Free will is another one of our ignorant prejudices about reality, which we believe because of our passions, rather than out of a rational reflection upon the facts. Spinoza writes that we're drawn hither and thither by our desires. He says that the volitions of man arise from these passions, which take hold of us when they want to, rather than when we want them to, and so we cannot speak seriously of being free of them, because they comprise what drives us, what we desire. One's desires or impulses is the very thing that creates the embodied human nature, and none of us have a choice in what the makeup of this nature shall be. And so accordingly, 200 years later, when Schopenhauer's arguing for what he calls the intelligible freedom of man, he still capitulates to the idea that man cannot choose his actions and he cannot choose his nature. He has no say in what that nature shall be. And in this idea, we can see the influence of Spinozism's ubiquity in German philosophy up to that point. And so Spinoza reimagines the world of matter as a world of mind, but reimagines the world of mind as being equally determined, just as a world of matter governed by eternal and unchanging laws would also be. Man is determined, God is determined. And I think it's in this that we see one of the consequences of Spinoza resolving the difference between matter and mind as two different substances, which we see in Descartes, because Descartes had also rendered the world in mechanistic terms, but because he had separated the substances of mind and body, he had held God to be outside of the world. God was therefore outside of predictable causes and limiting conditions. This is the consequence of those two differing views. So Descartes still believes in a kind of supernatural power of the freedom of the will, because mind or spirit can still be something, for lack of a better word, magical, that transcends the laws of the physical world. And then therefore, since we have that spirit within us, each have a soul, our own individual free will can transcend the laws of the physical world. Our minds can transcend the laws of the physical world. For Spinoza, however, mind and matter are different attributes of the same being. They actually aren't fundamentally different. Whether we're speaking of the intellectual attribute or the extended attribute, the law of causality holds, and it is absolute over both of them. Nothing can defy the will of God, so to speak, and the will of God is fixed, eternal, and omnipresent. Spinoza writes, quote, "The mind is determined for willing this or that by a cause which is determined in its turn by another cause, and this again by another, and so on to infinity." End quote. Those are exactly the kind of inquiries that Nietzsche was also undertaking around his middle period when he wrote the 3 books of Human All Too Human and Daybreak. If he, indeed, never delved into the world of Spinoza previously to 1881, then that would be very striking, the ways in which their thought developed along similar lines. Nietzsche wrote a passage in Human All Too Human, section number 106, entitled At the Waterfall, which seems to contain many of the same deterministic notions as Spinoza. Quote, "When we see a waterfall, we think we see freedom of will and choice in the innumerable turnings, windings, breakings of the waves. But everything is necessary. Each movement can be calculated mathematically. Thus it is with human actions. If one were omniscient, one would be able to calculate each individual action in advance, each step in the progress of knowledge, each error, each act of malice. To be sure, the acting man is caught in his illusion of volition. If the wheel of the world were to stand still for a moment, and an omniscient calculating mind were there to take advantage of this interruption, he would be able to tell into the farthest future of each being and describe every rut that wheel will roll upon. The acting man's delusion about himself, his assumption that free will exists, is also part of the calculable mechanism." End quote. So Nietzsche would have been writing those thoughts around the time of the late 1870s, So again, if he truly did not know Spinoza, as he says in that letter, and only encountered him in 1881, then I can imagine it would have been quite striking to Nietzsche himself also, to the point he might be motivated to declare Spinoza his precursor, upon realizing that the two had independently come to many of these same ideas. And it must be said, that is a rather arrogant statement, isn't it, to call a famous and influential figure of the past your precursor, which is, his significance is that he was a precursor to me. Perhaps that kind of lack of humility is not surprising coming from Nietzsche. In any case, we might compare that section of Nietzsche's to one of the most famous passages of Spinoza's concerning the thrown stone. In both cases, we have a natural phenomenon which concerns movement. In one case, water flowing downhill, the waterfall, and the other, a stone that is thrown. Gravity is an operative force in both, and in both cases, Nietzsche and Spinoza take a deterministic understanding of motion as it occurs within material nature, and then apply that to the human will, to human intellect. So Spinoza writes, quote, "Further conceive, I beg, that a stone, while continuing in motion, should be capable of thinking and knowing, that it is endeavoring, as far as it can, to continue to move. Such a stone, being conscious merely of its own endeavor, and not at all indifferent, would believe itself to be completely free, and would think that it continued in motion solely because of its own wish. This is that human freedom, which all boast that they possess, and which contains solely in the fact that men are conscious of their own desire, but are ignorant of the causes whereby that desire has been determined." End quote. That last line is terribly important. Men are conscious of their desires, but because they don't comprehend the causes of those desires, they make the mistake of thinking that they come out of the ether. That their choices are some magical, arbitrary production of something called their will, which consciously intends for those desires to come into being. Spinoza makes it absolutely clear that, as Nietzsche would argue much later, in so many words, freedom of the will is a grammatical fiction. Spinoza argues in Book 2 in a note on Proposition 35, quote, "Their idea of freedom is simply their ignorance of any cause for their actions. As for their saying that human actions depend on the will, this is a mere phrase without any idea to correspond thereto. What the will is and how it moves the body, they, none of them, know." End quote. And so at this point, some of you might be thinking, well, what am I supposed to do with such information? And it should be noted that very type of response is exactly why this magnum opus of Spinoza's is called the Ethics. Spinoza doesn't convey this argument of the interdependence of all phenomena, the eternal order of causality, simply as an idle intellectual exercise. Rather, Spinoza does something that philosophers have been doing in the Western tradition for a very long time, and that is redefining freedom. So many philosophical movements have put forward the argument that true freedom is not merely following one's whims, but rather consists of something else, something other than what is indicated by the word freedom, such as discipline or virtue, or the ability to affirm one's actions as their own, or whatever it might be. The Stoics did this, Kant did this, Nietzsche does this, so does Spinoza. And so in his famous essay of Human Bondage and the one that follows of Human Freedom, both contained in the Ethics, Spinoza addresses this eternal problem, that man feels as though he is in bondage to his passions, he's bound by his emotions or desires. That feeling is part of the human condition, and that man therefore always searches for freedom, freedom from this sense of bondage. Spinoza writes in the preface, quote, "Human infirmity in moderating and checking the emotions I name bondage, for when a man is prey to his emotions, he is not his own master, but lies at the mercy of fortune." End quote. Particularly, the culprits are the sad emotions, or the sad passions, fear and hope. These are based on our expectations for life, what our reason imposes on the world in accord with our own ideas of what perfection would be. When we live in the thrall of such expectations, we live in a state of fear and hope. And these are notably the motivating emotions that drive theology and religious belief. What Spinoza takes aim at is not convincing us to act in a different way, because of course all of our actions are already predetermined by past causes of which we have no knowledge or control. But Spinoza nevertheless offers us a way to salvation vis-a-vis how we feel about this state of affairs. When he describes the person in bondage as preyed upon by their emotions, he's referring to the fact that they let themselves be put into these mental states of fear or stress or excitation, indignation, frustration, and so on and so forth. But if we truly understood the nature of our situation, and I mean really deeply understood it in the core of our being, we wouldn't need to feel that way. We would understand that everything is unchangeable. There's no alternative to what is happening in a given moment. Everything is necessary. And therefore, we could simply see ourselves as in the hands of God, we might say. We wouldn't revile the bad things that happen to us, or at least we'd be able to see that even our reviling of it was the expression of something in us rather than expressing something objective within the situation. That our feeling about whatever perceived good or bad happening is simply part of our transitory dependent existence and are not absolute statements or value judgments. Spinoza writes, quote, "As for the terms good and bad, they indicate no positive quality in things regarded in themselves, but are merely modes of thinking, or notions which we form from the comparison of things one with another. Thus, one and the same thing can be at the same time good, bad, and indifferent. For instance, music is good for him that is melancholy, bad for him that mourns. For him that is deaf, it is neither good nor bad." End quote. It's that kind of attitude that allows you a measure of equanimity, and this is what Spinoza redefines as freedom. Freedom from the sad emotions, freedom from fear and hope, freedom from emotions that are against reason, and that ultimately cause us distress. That's what true freedom is. Freedom's not arbitrary whim in determining one's will or desires. Freedom is the intellectual knowledge that all is necessary. And so what Spinoza called the intellectual love of God, amor Dei, the love of totality, the love of all nature, this comes with this recognition of the necessity of everything, the interdependence of everything. This allows us to free ourselves from being in bondage to our feelings about whatever might happen in the course of our lives, because we see that what is bad is only bad for me and from my perspective. It's not bad in and of itself. It's not bad from the perspective of the whole. And moreover, it's simply a necessary happening that is unchangeable. And this kind of attitude will allow us to perceive our fellow man differently, especially when they transgress against us. It makes us less quick to praise and blame, more able to see that the people around us are simply acting due to their own causes and conditions. Ironically, this is a very Christian virtue, even though we can see the very clear influence on Nietzsche and his idea of amor fati. Nietzsche, for his part, writes in Human All Too Human, section 102, quote, "We don't accuse nature of immorality when it sends us a thunderstorm. Why do we call the injurious man immoral? Because in the first case, we assume necessity, and in the second, a voluntarily governing free will. But this distinction is in error." End quote. So the injurious man is like a thunderstorm. That doesn't mean you have to rejoice or say it's good that a thunderstorm destroys your house. it is decidedly not good from your perspective. But if you hold no such expectation that your house ought not be destroyed by thunderstorms, because what a silly notion, what kind of control do you have over that? You will not be surprised when such a thing does happen. And certainly no reasonable person would justify, getting mad and morally condemning thunderstorms. They're just weather systems caused by natural forces. What we don't wish to see is that the criminal is the exact same kind of phenomenon. If he comes and, let's say, robs your house or burns it down. Let's use another example, like your house is destroyed by a wildfire versus an arsonist burns your house down. In that case, we want to lay blame. We want to lay recriminations. We want to say that the arsonist had a choice not to behave the way that he did. And it's a wonderful example because in both cases, you are in exactly the same position. The same harm has been suffered, the burning down of your house. But in one case, you have like a moral interpretation of the event and you want to take revenge or get justice or however you want to describe it. And in the other case, you see the necessity of it happening. And even if you might be angry in some cosmic sense, the way somebody might be angry at God when a tragedy befalls them, I think most rational, mature people eventually realize when such a natural disaster affects them that it was simply, again, a matter of necessity, and they don't have that same sort of blame, recrimination, resentment against the situation. And so if one sees the error in such reasoning of laying blame against necessary events, it might not give you the ability to arbitrarily change your own behavior, which is also going to be driven by causes and conditions, pushed by impulses that are not authored by you. But if one can't change any of that, we can change how we feel about it. And so, once again, not just in his metaphysics, but in his morality, we can see how some interpreters have found a commonality between Spinozism and Buddhism. Because Buddhism is very much the same in terms of its claims that all beings exist in the state they're currently in due to their past karma, the consequences of their past actions, which now produce the causes of their current actions. And what the Buddhist strives to do is to relinquish those feelings of anguish at loss or of pleasure at gain, and to see the transitory nature of all phenomena, to see all things as dependent, empty, something which should not be clung to. Liberation is found in non-clinging. Spinoza's message is in many ways comparable to this Buddhist way of thinking, just as he is comparable to Nietzsche of the Middle Period. That, of course, should raise a question then as to what changed with Nietzsche, because, as we know, many of the passages in his published work in which Nietzsche discusses Spinoza are actually rather critical of Spinoza. Buddhism for Nietzsche is associated with life denialism and the resignationism of Schopenhauer. If Spinozism does represent something akin to perhaps a European Buddhism, that goes at least some of the way towards explaining why Nietzsche might have shifted his opinion of Spinoza, because he also shifted his opinion on Schopenhauer, whom Nietzsche identifies as another European Buddhist. To consider this European Buddhism in terms of its metaphysics, the influence of Spinozism on Schopenhauer is well known. Motion has always posed a metaphysical challenge, and explaining motion has long been a preoccupation of materialist philosophers. In dealing with motion, Spinoza adopts a concept taken from ancient philosophy and first imported into Enlightenment Europe by Descartes, and that is conatus. In Cartesian physics, the term conatus refers directly to an object's motion. Spinoza ascribed to conatus the tendency of an object to move, and he attributed it to the power of God within the world. Over the course of many propositions, Spinoza derives the conclusion that conatus is the drive of a being to continue existing in its given mode of existence, to persevere in its being. Motion takes place so that living beings can continue their existence. They move towards that which is pleasurable and flee from that which is painful. They seek out food and nourishment and run from predators, etc. They seek the best environment for themselves, we might say, the best conditions in which to realize their perfection. Spinoza writes, quote, "The power or endeavor of anything to persist in its own being is nothing else than the essence of that thing," end quote. And so Schopenhauer's will to live is more or less a restatement of Spinoza's notion of conatus. And so if you understand the effect of Schopenhauer on Nietzsche's thought, then you can see this direct line from Spinoza to Schopenhauer to Nietzsche. And perhaps it was because of this lineage that Nietzsche finds that kinship with Spinoza, in spite of the fact of having never known Spinoza's ideas before the early 1880s. The reason why Spinoza phrases his naturalistic account of a deterministic world in these theistic terms, whereas Nietzsche writes for a post-death of God world, is, in Nietzsche's estimation, just an artifact of time, place, and circumstance. And so the theistic interpretation of conatus versus Nietzsche's atheistic will to power and Schopenhauer's atheistic will to live, that's not really a rich disagreement. Really, where they truly diverge is how they understand this driving force of life. And that's where Nietzsche differs from both Schopenhauer and Spinoza. Nietzsche writes in one of the notes found in Will to Power, this is number 688, quote, "Spinoza's law of, quote, self-preservation ought really to put a stop to change. But this law is false. The opposite is true. It can be shown most clearly that every living thing does everything it can, not to preserve itself, but to become more," end quote. Given some of the past episodes we've done on Nietzsche's relationship to Schopenhauer, I think the difference or the modification that he makes with the conatus idea should be rather clear, that a will simply to continue existing, as Nietzsche says, should put a stop to change. It's not actually an explanation of change, and therefore Spinoza's whole idea of the will to persevere in your own being cannot itself be an explanation for motion. And that might sound like a rather esoteric disagreement, but it becomes very starkly clear when we look at will to live versus will to power, or Nietzsche's difference with Darwin. The will to preserve oneself as they are versus the will to become something more, which might involve sacrificing what you are now, destroying yourself as you are now in order to effect a transformation into something greater. There's, of course, that passage in Beyond Good and Evil where Nietzsche says that what a living thing wants to do is to discharge its strength, and that self-preservation is only a very common side effect of this. If we agree that there's a Spinozist influence on both Goethe and Wagner, then the interpretive framework of Spinoza as that first European Buddhist also has a great explanatory power for understanding Nietzsche's engagement with him. Nietzsche writes in one of his unpublished notes found in The Will to Power that Spinoza's ideal was an anemic ideal, but that he nevertheless gave rise genealogically to Goethe, who put forward the highest ideal, which is, in Nietzsche's terms, quote, the pagan ideal, end quote. And so a life-affirming Hellenist, a great artistic soul like Goethe, quote, found his saint in Spinoza, end quote. You know, this sickly pantheist who preached a kind of Buddhistic passive acceptance of reality somehow gives rise to the greatness of that very worldly and passionate artist, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. But I think Spinoza's influence on Nietzsche, or at least the overall similarity in their perspective, goes farther than any of this. We can see it in Spinoza's Amor Dei, the love of God, the trust in providence, compared with Nietzsche's Amor Fati, the love of fate. Nietzsche was certainly aware of Spinoza's effect on Goethe, and the term trusting fatalism is actually found in his description of Goethe. Nietzsche saw the ways in which one of his own higher men was profoundly inspired by that Spinozist approach. This sort of equanimous, serene relinquishing of all pretensions to ownership or of responsibility over one's nature or one's future or over the world itself, that this was used by Goethe in a certain way to bring forth that highest ideal. Perhaps it is the example that we find in Spinoza's life, however, in the very Christian virtues that he promoted and that he advocated for, that gave Nietzsche pause. Perhaps this is part of why there's always this tension in Nietzsche between becoming what one is and giving style to one's character. To become who you are is that faded feeling. To give style is a creative feeling. And without necessarily changing his attitude about freedom of the will, Nietzsche began to become equally suspicious of the doctrine of unfree will. And the short answer for why is because such knowledge could be used as a permission slip for nihilism. All is fated. Who cares? Why try? It will happen or it doesn't. That's a kind of fatalism that, pardon the pun, could be quite fatal. And so, as Nietzsche emerges into what's usually called his mature period, the works following Zarathustra, he becomes concerned with affirming one's self-responsibility without affirming any sense of moral responsibility. Nietzsche also becomes engaged in a project to redefine freedom in his own way. In his case, freedom is found in the kind of person who's unbounded from the dictates of collective morality, from the voice of the multitude, which has been impressed upon all of us in the form of the conscience. Particularly for Nietzsche, freedom is freedom from the bad conscience, from feelings of guilt and self-recrimination. In many ways, Spinoza is aimed at the same thing, though, liberation, but within one's sentiments, within the way they feel about things. Liberation from the sad emotions in Spinoza's case. And like Nietzsche, it must be said, Spinoza has a real love of life, a zeal for life. Spinoza writes, quote, "There cannot be too much merriment. Nothing save gloomy superstition prohibits laughter." End quote. And I see a way of living in Spinoza that is like the path of the Epicureans, governed by moderation, by taking delight in the simple things, the little things, and the pursuit of wisdom and good, solid friendships. By all accounts, just like Epicurus, Spinoza lived out these virtues. He didn't just preach them. On many, many occasions, when those who supported Spinoza, supported his ideas, tried to give him large monetary gifts, he would always refuse them. They had to insist over and over again to get him to acquiesce. He lived a mostly Spartan existence, and even if it wasn't completely solitary and ascetic, as popular exaggerations sometimes go, Spinoza was most certainly a wanderer who left his tribe and never joined another. He did not permit himself the vice of speaking against what he knew to be true. He displays a complete absence of resentment toward the people who banished him, the people who excommunicated him, the people who cursed him. Spinoza writes, quote, "He who rightly knows that all things follow from the necessity of divine nature and come to pass according to eternal, natural, and regular laws will find nothing at all that is worthy of hatred, laughter, or contempt, nor will he deplore anyone. But as far as human virtue can go, he will endeavor to act well and rejoice. A strong man hates no one, is enraged with no one, envies no one, is indignant with no one, and is in no wise proud. He who lives under the guidance of reason endeavors as much as possible to repay hatred, rage, contempt, etc., with love and nobleness. He who wishes to avenge injuries by reciprocal hatred will live in misery. Hatred is increased by reciprocated hatred, and on the contrary can be demolished by love. Men under the guidance of reason desire nothing for themselves, which they do not also desire for the rest of mankind." End quote. And so, in these words, we have the same sentiments that would one day be echoed by Martin Luther King, among others. Hatred breeds hatred, but it can be defeated by love. Again, something that seems like a mere truism to us, but it's remarkable that Spinoza comes to this conclusion from a worldview that is free from dogmatic religious prescriptions on how one should act and feel. Unlike Pascal, Spinoza does not love man for God's sake, even though he feels that naturally we ought to hate ourselves and everyone else. He comes to it, this feeling of loving all mankind or repaying hatred with love from reason alone, which is, again, quite remarkable. And we can also see a prefiguration of Kant's categorical imperative, insofar as a man who follows reason wills whatever it is he wants for himself as a universal law. And even though all of those successors to Spinoza might strike you as rather anti-Nietzschean, we also have an attitude that's not far off from that of Nietzsche: the necessity of all things, but as a cause for rejoicing in life. Nevertheless, it's worth considering the notion of the bad conscience in light of one of Nietzsche's critiques of Spinoza, as it appears in Genealogy of Morals, Essay 2, Section 15. Nietzsche says that Spinoza was, quote, "the man who had expelled good and evil into human fantasies, and had irascibly defended the honor of his, quote, free God, against those blasphemers who claimed that in everything God worked sub ratione bone, with good reason. But that means that God would be subordinate to fate, a claim which in truth would be the greatest of all contradictions." End quote. That last sentence there, Nietzsche's quoting from Spinoza. Now, back to the passage. Quote, "For Spinoza, the world had gone back again into that state of innocence in which it had existed before the invention of bad conscience. So with that, what then had become of the morsus conscientiae? The opposite of gaudium, joy, Spinoza had finally told himself, is sorrow, accompanied by the image of something over and done with, which happened contrary to all expectation." Ethics 3, Proposition 18. In a manner no different from Spinoza's, those instigating evil who incurred punishment have for thousands of years felt, so far as their crime is concerned, something has unexpectedly gone awry here. Not, "I should not have done that." They submitted to their punishment as people submit to a sickness or some bad luck or death, with that brave fatalism free of revolt which, for example, even today gives the Russians an advantage over us Westerners in coping with life. End quote. So there's a dig against Spinoza in there that is very subtle, and it's worth pointing out that it's a jab that Nietzsche takes in the context of acknowledging Spinoza as, well, a precursor in so many words, another person who had gone back into that state of innocence which exists prior to the bad conscience. That's the innocence that Nietzsche believed he found in the ancient Greeks during what he called their tragic age. Even those among the Greeks who called existence faulty, like Anaximander, did not consider it morally blameworthy. That sophistication does not fully arrive until the creation of sin and the guilt of mankind and the idea of a sin-cursed world and original sin. So, Nietzsche is traveling on the pathway of philology and a study of the pre-Socratics and Greek drama. Spinoza travels via the road of mathematized rationalist philosophy. And Spinoza, by this completely separate path, somehow arrives at that same sentiment of an innocent world, moral irresponsibility, the highest virtue as a kind of indifference to one's fate, and that as a means of salvation. So I don't want to downplay the remarkable compliment that is also in this passage that Nietzsche is paying to Spinoza, because that is an amazing accomplishment, to return to that innocence. But the subtle jab at Spinoza is, of course, the comparison to the Russian soldier simply resigning himself to his death with no resistance, or a criminal submitting to his punishment in the way that one submits to a sickness, the way that one submits before something which they know they're totally helpless against. I think that Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche might actually be helpful, in that all such approaches to life as Spinozism, Epicureanism, and Buddhism are passive forms of affirmation. One sees truth as the duty of accepting or affirming the real, to placidly accept what is out of this recognition of helplessness. Spinoza and these other ideologies teach us to do this, to affirm life, but passively. Nietzsche's project, on the other hand, eventually turns its attention to the pursuit of an active affirmation, a form of innocence, but which is not merely passive, but also creative. This is what is dramatized in the three metamorphoses of the camel, lion, and child. Spinoza, we might say, from the perspective of later Nietzsche, is a spiritual camel, accepting all that comes to him with the fatalism of the condemned criminal or the Russian soldier. But what Nietzsche's amor fati comes to mean is almost the opposite of this, the innocent who is also a creator, an affirmer who is also active. And so it's telling that Nietzsche almost always speaks of religions such as Buddhism or Epicureanism as ideologies for the decline and old age of a civilization, whereas Nietzsche's goal is allegorized as a creative, playful child. There's something old and tired in these philosophies that seek to regulate man's emotions, as this means, if you have to regulate your emotions, it means your instincts are already failing and in need of such external regulation. And so the entire premise that mankind needs a means of coping with life is already just such a value judgment from the perspective of the old and the infirm. Nietzsche's ideal affirmation is a young form of affirmation, something self-forgetful, instinctual, irresponsible, and but presumptuous and willing to create and assert. But again, in spite of this important difference, I don't want to understate how important it is that Spinoza's philosophy takes us to a state of the soul prior to the bad conscience, because it's prior to good and evil. And for Nietzsche, those are the fundamental problems that have corrupted human thought and have led astray all philosophical thought. Pretty much up to the point of Nietzsche himself, within Nietzsche's view. So Spinoza is one of the few exceptions to that. And so while he can't be said to be free of the Christian morality by any stretch, he nevertheless entertains a metaphysics which is pantheist and thus in some sense closer to that pagan metaphysics of, say, Heraclitus. And I think I would even say it's a category of thought entirely its own. Spinoza's world is equally spirit and material. It is miraculous and it's mathematical. And because of his pantheistic view, Spinoza, even though he capitulates in many ways to the religious morality, does not condemn the world. I mean, how can he? God is the world, and Spinoza is intoxicated with the love of God. Where I think Nietzsche is perhaps harshest to Spinoza is in Beyond Good and Evil, where he doesn't attack the ideas of Spinoza whatsoever. This is actually somewhat typical of Nietzsche. In his private correspondence, he praises the ideas of Spinoza, and then in his public work, he attacks him, but on the basis of his style, which he says reveals something about the inner character of Spinoza as a person. He calls the style of the ethics, quote, hocus pocus in mathematical form, by means of which Spinoza has, as it were, clad his philosophy in mail and mask. In fact, the love of his wisdom, to translate the term fairly and squarely, in order thereby to strike terror at once into the heart of the assailant who should dare cast a glance on that invincible maiden, that Pallas Athene. How much of personal timidity and vulnerability does this masquerade of a sickly recluse betray? End quote. And so Nietzsche's argument amounts to this. Spinoza's most notable characteristic as a philosopher is probably not his pantheism or his deterministic outlook on human action, nor his attitude on morality. Spinoza's defining feature is the mathematical style of his arguments. The fact that he concludes the lines of his work with QED, which is that's an abbreviation for quod erat demonstrandum, the translation of which is which was to be demonstrated. And this was traditionally included at the conclusion of a mathematical proof. Spinoza is probably the first to use QED to conclude philosophical arguments. Nietzsche says this stylistic approach to philosophy reveals Spinoza's insecurity. It reveals how seriously he needed to make his own view of nature and God logically unassailable. He needed to clad his philosophy, his truths, in plate mail armor to scare off anyone who might try to contradict those truths. And as we all know, Spinoza got what he wanted. Because Spinoza's Ethics is such a difficult, imposing text, it's simply not read to the degree that it might have been if Spinoza had employed a style closer to, say, Descartes, right? Descartes was a philosophical style that Spinoza hated and thought was, at best, like farcical. Descartes wrote like he was writing a diary to himself. It's not as if Descartes was not also a brilliant mathematician and scientist, but the work that he's known for, his philosophical work, the Meditations, are widely read even today, and that's because they're written in a way which is approachable, because of the way that they speak directly to the existential questions that we all have, and he does it in such plain language. Spinoza, on the other hand, made his work unapproachable, and consequently it has been more rarely approached. And shouldn't he have been aware that this would be the outcome of that decision? And so, does such a stylistic choice betray a shyness, a timidity, a desire not to have one's ideas subjected to the vulnerable position of being criticized, picked apart, vulgarized? I feel I should say Nietzsche's characterization of Spinoza as a sickly recluse has to be taken with a hint of irony for it to be anything other than downright hypocritical, because once again we find a similarity between these two thinkers, and that both could rightly be called sickly recluses, at least for some significant period of time in their lives. And in both cases, the time of being a sickly recluse coincided with the time of greatest philosophical productivity. So Nietzsche really is one to talk here. In fact, it's hard for me not to see the prototypical free spirit and a type that Nietzsche would actually call a good European when I look at the life of Spinoza. In spite of all Nietzsche's jabs at him, this is a man without a national, religious, or ethnic commitment. He was simply free from all previous dogmas. He entered into the philosophical discourse as his own man. He refused to censor himself or accommodate his thinking to the tastes of those around him. Will Durant writes that Spinoza was, quote, the outcast who could find a home in none of the religions, since none would let him conceive God in terms that science could accept, end quote. And accordingly, as Durant argues, Spinoza lived like a saint. He was a man who had to depend on himself and his own virtues, and he didn't just write of his philosophical ideas, but demonstrated them in his character. And his is the kind of character that makes one think well of all mankind and all that we're capable of. In Nietzsche's work, when Zarathustra tells us, quote, I am the eternal wandering Jew, though I am neither eternal nor a Jew, end quote, perhaps we could once again see in Spinoza Nietzsche's Precursor, the outcast among outcasts, with allegiance to no one and nothing but his truth, his God, rather than God as he's spoken of and understood, on the lips of lesser men. To this day, the intellectual's idea of God is usually some variation on the God of Spinoza, the theme that Spinoza first set, for better or for worse, right? The geometrical faith, the intellectual love of God that Spinoza professes, has insensibly found its way into the zeitgeist. And so when Nietzsche wrote that God is dead, did he mean the Christian God, or would he include Spinoza's God? Did he mean just the Christian God, or is Spinoza's God dead? Perhaps a more important question, if we here in the modern day are to say that God is dead, shall we include Spinoza's God? I'm not sure that Spinoza's God is dead, but I'll leave all of you to ponder that. And with that, we will conclude the episode. Join me next time for the work that Nietzsche called the best German book. We're finally going back to Goethe. It's been far too long, and this time it's Eckermann's Conversations with Goethe. Hope you'll join me then. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.